Unit 5, Struggling for Justice at Home and Abroad, 1901 to 1945. Chapter 28, Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt. There are 5 main things that you have to remember for this chapter. The overarching theme of this chapter is that reformers called progressives sought to clean up America on behalf of the people. Teddy Roosevelt became the best known and most active progressive. Number 1. The progressives grew out of the Populist Party, or the People's Party, and sought to correct injustices. Number 2. The progressives and muckraker writers attacked city corruption, corporate greed, poor living and working conditions, alcohol, and women's right to vote. Each of these saw laws and/or amendments passed in attempt to better the conditions. Number 3. Teddy Roosevelt made a name for himself as a trust buster. That is, he broke up a few high-profile companies that he said were monopolies, or trusts. Busting trusts and thus creating competition was to benefit the average person and the small businesses. He also obtained huge tracts of land, usually out west, for parks and conservation. Roosevelt picked Taft to follow him, but Taft began to stray from Roosevelt's ways, and the two split. Chapter 29, The Wilsonian Progressivism at Home and Abroad. There are 4 things that you have to remember for this chapter. The overarching theme of the chapter is that Woodrow Wilson was an idealist, that he had high principles and would not bend them for practical purposes. Number 1. Wilson won the presidency mainly because Teddy Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate and split the Republican vote between Taft and Roosevelt. Number 2. Wilson was an idealist and a progressive who sought to clean up problems. He attacked the tariff because it was too high, the banks because they were too corrupt, and the trusts because they were milking the people. Number 3. Wilson hated war and wanted American foreign policy to be fair and just to all. Conditions in Latin America, however, forced this peaceful president to take military action. One notable incident is when he ordered the U.S. Army to chase Pancho Villa in Mexico. Number 4. The war in Europe had begun. In the Atlantic Ocean, German subs had been sinking ships carrying Americans. This Lusitania was one of them. Wilson tried to keep America out of the war, and he did, but only for the time being. Chapter 30. The War to End War. The overarching theme of this chapter is that America reluctantly joined World War I. She then threw herself into the war effort with full force. There are 6 things that you have to remember for this chapter. Number 1. President Wilson outlined the war's objectives with his 14 points. They set the goals of free seas, self-determination after the war, and establishing a body to prevent future wars. Number 2. A military draft was instituted, the first since the Civil War. Number 3. Women went to work for more than they had ever done, and black soldiers were drafted into the military into segregated units. Number 4. The Americans focused their military efforts in protecting Paris from the Germans. Number 5. At the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson agreed to allow England and France to punish Germany for the war. In return, they agreed to start Wilson's, quote, League of Nations. Number 6. The U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty/League of Nations. They did not want to turn over America's decision-making to a foreign body like the League of Nations. Chapter 31. American Life in the Roaring Twenties. The overarching theme for Chapter 31 is that America clipped along through the 20s at a fast pace and ran through many cultural changes. There are 5 things that you have to remember about this chapter. Number 1. A Red Scare struck America in the 20s. Fear of communism resonated through society and was fueled by mail bombings and illustrated by the Sacco and Vanzetti executions. 2. Anti-immigration ran high as well. Laws were passed to limit immigration and specifically to limit the new immigrants from Italy and Poland. Number 3. The Scopes monkey trial illustrated the new controversy of evolutionism versus creationism. Number 4. Businesses had a good run in the 20s and consumers bought products wildly, often on credit or with an installment plan. Number 5. 3 Republicans presidents were pro-business. The economy and consumers got running too fast and coupled over with overbuying the stock market initiated the stock crash and the Great Depression. Chapter 32. The Politics of Boom and Bust. The overarching theme for Chapter 32 is that the 20 politics were a time of corruption and business was running wild, kind of a throwback to the late 1800s. There are 4 things that you have to remember for this chapter. Number 1. President Harding had several scandals underneath him, notably the Teapot Dome scandal over oil. Number 2. America entered into policies of isolationism, whereby the U.S. wanted to look after herself and leave Europe alone. Number 3. Coolidge was very pro-business, following a hands-off approach by government. Number 4. Hoover led the same ideas with his rugged individualism phrase. When the stock crash hit and the Great Depression started, Hoover was very reluctant and slow to take the government action. Chapter 33. The Great Depression and the New Deal. The overarching theme of this chapter is that FDR led the federal government to his massive New Deal programs. The goal was to reinvigorate the U.S. economy and jolt it right up out of the Great Depression. There are 5 things that you have to remember about this chapter. Number 1. FDR quickly got many New Deal programs passed. The general philosophy was, the government will start massive projects and spend huge quantities of money, and this will jumpstart the economy. Number 2. These programs hit on all walks of life. Emphasis was placed on creating jobs, creating housing, construction projects, and restoring the confidence in banks. Number 3. Though FDR was popular, there were critics to the New Deal. Some saying that it did too much, others saying that it did too little. Number 4. FDR pretty much had his way with Congress until he asked for more Supreme Court judges and was finally told no. Number 5. All told, the New Deal may have helped the economy a bit, but it did not boost the U.S. from the Depression. Chapter 34. FDR and the Shadow of War. The overarching theme of Chapter 34 is that dictatorships forced FDR to stray from American issues and to look outside of the U.S. FDR wanted peace, but events slowly drew the U.S. closer into World War II. Now, there are 4 things that you have to remember for this chapter. Number 1. When it became evident that both Japan and Germany were marching towards militarism, FDR and Europe made it clear that they wanted peace. This effectively gave the dictators a go-ahead sign. Number 2. Events showed war was inevitable. Japan attacked China, Spain became a dictatorship, and Italy and Germany did as well. Number 3. After watching Hitler go on the move, he finally broke a pledge not to attack Poland, and England and France went to war. The U.S. still wanted to stay out. Number 4. As the situation overseas deteriorated, the U.S. began to support England and France more openly with words and supplies. Finally, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, Japanese, the U.S. entered World War II. Chapter 35, America and World War II. The overarching theme for Chapter 35 is that the U.S. fought a two-front war, one in Europe and one in the Pacific. To win, America mobilized its massive resources of people and materials, then steadily fought to overwhelm the enemy. There are 4 things that you have to remember about this chapter. Number 1, the first goal of the U.S. in the war was to mobilize. This meant signing up thousands of troops and switching the American economy over to war. For example, it was time to stop making sedans and start building bombers. Number 2, the war affected all Americans. Men of all races went to war, and women took the jobs that the men had left. Number 3, in the Pacific, the U.S. island hopped over 4 years from Hawaii all the way to Okinawa, and were knocking on Japan's door. Finally, the atomic bomb drove the Japanese to surrender. Number 4, in Europe, the U.S. and her allies worked from North Africa up through Italy and toward the soft underbelly of Germany. Then, a massive D-Day invasion drove the Nazis back to Germany, where Hitler committed suicide and his generals surrendered. Thank you very much for listening.